Signal check. Signal check. 1, 2, 1, 2. So we'll give it a shot here. Remember, it's a long delay.
Reverend John! Oh, it's good to see you! No, not yet. How are you? It's good to welcome back. Yeah, we're glad to have you back. You know the drill. Sign in, feet on the corner there.
Okay. And I don't
Welcome to the Iliff School of Theology and Pulpit Exchange. My name is Karen Ware-Joseph, and I am the Chief Operations Officer for Iliff, and also the Program Director for the Lilly Grant, which funds the Pulpit Exchange in addition to other projects that we have going on here at Iliff. The person who you also probably have talked to frequently tonight is John Hurst, and he is the Assistant Program Director. So I just really appreciate that you all have shown up tonight for what is going to be a very intellectually stimulating conversation, not only between the two individuals that we mentioned in the ad, but also there'll be an opportunity for question and answers coming from you all in conversation with our two presenters. I also would like for you to know that tonight we have takeaway boxes of food, but eat as much as you want tonight, like go back to the table as many times as you'd like to do so. But also if you want to take something home, we like it when you do that as well, because we want you to be well fed. So welcome back for those of you who have come before, and welcome, a brand new welcome to those of you who are new. We're so glad to see you here, and we're glad to know. John told me that at least one person found out about the event from Eventbrite, and that is part of what we're trying to do, is reach out to not only the communities that we know, but people that we don't know and that don't know us yet, and we're glad that that's taking place. So the next voice that you will hear will be Dr. Kathy Kelsey, who will introduce our presenters for the evening. Thank you.
Good evening. It is my privilege to introduce two individuals whom I admire greatly. The Reverend Dr. Andy Dunning is the senior pastor at University Park United Methodist Church, located right over there, getting myself oriented with the curtains closed. Andy has served United Methodist churches throughout Colorado and has extensive expertise in nonprofit leadership as well, strategic planning and community development. He earned a PhD from Southern Methodist University in ethics and an MDiv from Iliff, yay Iliff. In addition to his pastoral leadership, Andy has played a key role in initiatives focused on domestic violence prevention, poverty alleviation, and faith-based community engagement. His work in the nonprofit sector has included roles in project management, fundraising, and strategic direction for a variety of organizations. Many clergy, including myself, Andy, turn to Andy as a conversation partner. He asks great questions that open into unexpected insights, as I expect we will notice this evening. So join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Andy Dunning. Dr. Phillip Butler is Assistant Professor of Theology and Black Posthuman Artificial Intelligence Systems at Iliff. He's an international scholar whose work primarily focuses on the intersections of neuroscience, technology, spirituality, and Blackness. He uses the wisdom of these spaces to engage in critical and constructive analysis on Black posthumanism, artificial intelligence, and pluriversal future realities. He's also the founder of the Seeker Project, a distinctly Black conversational artificial intelligence with mental health capacities. It gets more interesting from here. Phillip has theorized artificial cognitive architectures for synthetic evolving life forms, self. Think about that for a moment. Artificial cognitive architectures for synthetic evolving life forms. He's presented on brain-computer interfaces that are emotionally regulating and spiritual experience inducing. In other words, He is thinking, researching, and imagining desirable possibilities that are barely on the edge of the consciousness of most of us, or at least I'll own it, barely on the edge of my consciousness. His work requires a deep understanding of persons in all of our dimensions, which makes it theological in ways that Enlightenment theologians, like the guys I studied, never imagined theology should address, let alone could address. Dr. Butler is partner and director of Iliff's AI Institute, where he leads the 80/20 project, which has 3 foci: working to change how computers literally see people, changing how computers relate to culturally iterative languages, and the project is actually building the bones for a data ownership model that it hopes will create a relational framework for the way AI is made around the globe. Dr. Butler is the author of Black Transhuman Liberation Theology, Spirituality and Technology, and most recently the editor of the volume Critical Black Futures, Speculative Theories and Explorations. He is published in journals such as the Black Scholar, Journal of Posthuman Studies, and the Journal of Future Studies. He's currently working on his second monograph, Still Black Posthuman, A Theory of Uncertainty and Disorder. I expect my mind to be blown again this evening. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Phillip Butler? Gentlemen, dance us into a conversation, please.
Well, hi.
Hey, everybody. How we doing?
I'm well. How are you?
You know, it's Wednesday.
It is that. You know, so I was listening to Kathy introduce us, and in particular listening to Kathy introduce you, and I thought what I'd really like to do, especially after reading your book, Black Transhuman Liberation Theology, is what I'd really like to do is just sit down and listen to you talk.
Yeah.
So I'm probably...
You're just going to walk away?
Yeah, so I'm leaving now. But I thought, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to just ask you a question that follows up on a kind of a preliminary conversation you and I had when we were talking about the use of AI in churches. And right now, my experience or my awareness of the use of AI in churches, and in preparing for this conversation, I had talks with several of my colleagues about how they are using AI, or if they are. I think most of us are probably not using it much at all. And to the degree that we are, it's things like using ChatGPT-4 to find or search for things like, what would be a great stewardship theme this year? Or how should I approach this topic with this sort of biblical reference? Or I did talk with one colleague, and I thought this was interesting, who his church cannot afford to hire a graphic designer sort of production person. So he was using DALL-E, the image AI, the image generation AI, to come up with some really beautiful images for sort of bulletin covers and posters around the church. But when you and I talked about this, I thought you drew a really important distinction, which is that is the use of AI in order to continue church business as usual. And we're just doing church, we're doing what we've always done, we're using these tools to continue doing what we've always done. And I thought the really interesting and important distinction that you drew is the use of AI for actually sort of liberative purposes within churches and within other kinds of communities as well. And so I looked at the Seeker Project online that I know you've been very involved with, and I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit about the work that you are doing that pushes AI or the use of AI in that liberative direction.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, or a series of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
But I think when we think about AI and kind of the way that it's used, whether it be by churches or marketers or whatever, the way that this technology works, it's meant to make life faster. And that makes sense if you need to like come up with 12 sermons in 3 minutes, right? And that's helpful. But in making things faster, what we find ourselves susceptible to is going down our current paths at a faster rate. And if we say we want to go in a different direction, then that raises other questions. And so we have an opportunity here, right? Do we decide to go light years ahead in the spaces that we want, that we're currently in, which I think in some ways we're, given the ways that, you know, folks are responding to the world, it seems like that's not necessarily what we want to do. Right. It's almost what we have to do, you know, in order to, you know, sustain a level of, you know, just kind of keeping the lights on, so to speak. But if we're attempting to shift the trajectory, right, of an arc of history, right, then we probably should use the technology that's capable of moving at this speed and kind of pumping the brakes, or at the very least pivoting very quickly somewhere else. But that also requires a different perspective around framing what this technology is, a different understanding of what it can do, but also kind of fostering and cultivating a particular type of imagination that allows for us to now shift our gears and move towards the worlds that we say we want to have versus the worlds that we currently have at a faster pace. When we first started the Institute, and mind you, I came on about a year later, one of the things that we talked about was kind of bias being embedded heavily within artificial intelligence. And we know that that's a reality. And if you ever worked in the back end of programming a language model or just any particular model at hand, you recognize that there are weights that are given to certain parameters. And you also recognize that most of this is biased on purpose. Now, the question becomes, if we can't remove the bias, right, how do we then bias towards the results we want? And people can say that that's not objective, but the other question, what is objective? And if we're already questioning objectivity and we're looking to utilize this technology, then I think part of it is to work towards setting the weights and the parameters and the biases in a way that would help us materialize the type of realities that we say we want. And so again, it's about actively constructing realities versus utilizing somebody else's tools that fit within the imagination of someone else. And so this, you know, kind of using more of a biblical reference of sorts, right? You know, think about stewardship, as you mentioned, or you could think about what it means, right? When the Christ figure says, "Aren't you God's?" And so if this is the case, like it goes back on a level of personal responsibility. Like at what point do we take responsibility for the worlds that we're shaping? Because everything that we do is an active, culmination towards the formation of something. And so what are we making by the actions that we're taking?
Yeah, and one of the things that puts me in mind of is that in some way when you talk about weighting the various parameters and the elements of the AI that you're using, it seems to me sort of a broader way of talking about that would be that you're proposing some ethical guardrails, right, for what the thing can and can't do, or what it will and won't. I'm going to use a term, think, what it will or won't think. And what I have wondered is how those ethical guardrails, what are some of the priorities that you would put on those ethical guardrails? What are sort of the ethical principles that you would say, these have to be weighted really strongly?
Chaos. And I say that mainly because if part of without going into a crap ton of slides and giving a full history of this, you kind of have to imagine in some ways that everything that we have that's been provided to us functions on a missionary scale, that it's like, hey, please adopt this technology, please incorporate it into your life. And if you don't fully get it, well, you can take classes at the Apple Bar and now you'll figure out how to fully, make sense of this thing. I say all that to suggest when technologists and businesses and industries are shaping these technologies, they're doing so with a very specific end user in mind. And the specificity of the end user that they have in mind is very much so, it's a very general kind of down the center, but it's also very white, very male, and kind of has a socioeconomic kind of framing, and so it's bent towards one particular mode of life. And so when I say chaos, the question really becomes, how do we create technologies that can fit to anybody's life? How can we make technologies that proliferate various modes of culture, embodiment, gender, sexual, all of these things that allow for it to really come into fruition in beautiful ways that unfold in ways that can't unfold under current technological structures? And so if we're trying to bust this thing wide open, then we have to kind of open the doors to making sure that it's not going to focus and recenter again back on the same kind of parameters. All that to say, when we welcome in these things, the question becomes like, how do we decentralize the technological framework? How do we localize it? So if you were talking about more specifics, right? One of the things that we do at the Institute is work towards precision and localization, right? Artificial intelligence is primarily a game of predictive mathematics. And that's fine when you have a certain history that you're feeding this technology and you have a particular future in mind. However, if you're trying to get it to fit you and everyone else in this room and everybody in Louisiana or wherever else, like you're now recognizing that you can't make everything for everyone. But what if you could? And that requires a localization. That requires an acknowledgement and an awareness of the histories of the specific spaces, an awareness of how AI fits in, and not just like, I think we kind of see the input, but in a very real way, right? This is water supplies, right? These are minerals, right? These are rare metals. Like, these are all kind of very ecological things that take a toll on various geographies, let alone what does it mean to take a concept of a technology and allow it to be made prevalent and relevant to spaces that were not the initial kind of end user in mind. So if we say there's no end user, but it's more so, what does it mean to kind of fit these technologies around people's lives as opposed to fit the lives around people's technologies? I think that becomes an inverse kind of approach to it that I think is a much more kind of liberative framework.
So in the sense that you're talking, if I'm understanding you correctly, you would the AI that you're envisioning be trained on a very sort of hyper-localized set of data? So if I wanted to create an AI that was useful and liberative to a group of marginalized and oppressed people, say, now how would you set that up so that it could fulfill that function, so it could do that? Are you training it on a very localized set of people and their experiences, or what are you doing there?
Right. So I think in this regard, you have to kind of almost like a funnel, so to speak. So you start very broad, and you get more, you winnow away at it, and you get more and more local. So for instance, at the Institute last year, we spent the better half of the year building a Black language data set, right? So the first 7 months of the year, we collected data anywhere from like a Sojourner Truth piece of writing, Zordon and Herstrin. We have stuff from the Martin TV show, always like Atlanta TV show, right, with Donald Glover. There's all types of stuff in there. And we built it, and then we tiered it out kind of in a vertical sense, where it was like the turn of the 20th century, early mid-20th century, civil rights from like the 60s to the 80s, and then we built it, the last phrase, like the 80s to present. So that was kind of a broader sense. And now, this year, what we've done, we have a prototype of it now. We've added, so first of all, we took the language model, we took the data set, we turned it into a language model. And then we took the language model and turned it into an agent. Agents are a little bit different than language models in that a model does one particular thing. Agents incorporate multiple kind of valences, as well as potentially like an internet search. So it's like it's at the top of the food chain in terms of cutting edge at the moment. But one of the facets that we added was mental health. So we trained it on various psychospiritual and psychotherapeutic modalities so that it can have generative conversations specifically in that. But the way that it responds will be reflective of a specific culture. And so as we continue down this road, right, we want to go to cities like Chicago and back home where I'm from in the DC area or Atlanta, and we want to find what are the vernaculars of these various spaces. And so as we get closer to these different places, now we're adding more texture, right? So the whole point of this is to get granular so that the delivery system recognizes where somebody's from is able to respond in kind and have a reflection of their identity, right, and a reflection of their culture in a way that would open up different relationships and different avenues with technologies that are currently very much so like a delivery system that's like take this or not. Whereas what we're trying to do is fit the technologies to the contours of people's lives.
So you're really talking about culturally sensitive AI.
Culturally sensitive, I don't know if I feel like it's a limiting term in the sense that, like, because when somebody's culturally sensitive, it's almost like they feel like there's, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like there's eggshells around the room, right?
Okay.
And so what I'm trying to get it to be is, so if we take one step back and think about this in a transhumanist framing, like if the majority of transhumanists forget about before any of these transhumanists can make anything, majority of these transhumanists want to say that biodiversity and culture are things that we can do away with. So when we talk about the making of technologies or AI agents or AI itself, we're talking about a replication of a particular mode of embodiment, a particular type of culture. And so what we say this is, when we're looking at this, we're saying in a roundabout way that whiteness is being encapsulated in one particular AI body. And so what does it mean then when we can do this for every other culture so that these cultures do not get lost in the digitization of who we are and how we move into the future?
So that leads me to a question that I've been thinking about a lot after you and I talked. I listened to, and some of you may have heard this as well, I listened to a podcast that featured Mustafa Soliman, who is the owner, well, not the owner, he's the president of Microsoft's AI company. And he talked about the goal, he talked about how now we've got sort of ChatGPT, we've got these other AI tools. We can go to them and we can ask them questions. And that's sort of the state of the art right now. Have conversations with them. They can, I think for a lot of people, they would probably pass the Turing test, which is this famous test proposed in the 1950s. Everybody, we're all acquainted with the Turing test. The idea is that if the machine is in another room and you can't tell if you're talking to a machine or a human, if the machine can fool you, then it's passed the Turing test and it is for all practical purposes intelligent. So it was proposed by the mathematician Alan Turing. And so nowadays we have machines that can do that. And Suleiman's plan, or not plan, what he said was the next step is these, and I jotted down a quotation from Suleiman. Let me see if I can find it, because I thought it was telling and really interesting. Of course, now I can't find it. It's in my notes. I got a ton of notes. Yeah, anyway, basically what he said was these things are going to go beyond being question and answer sort of tools. The next phase is these things will be our teachers. They will be our intellectual support. They will be our emotional support. And not only that, they will anticipate and carry out tasks on our behalf. And some of the marketers are calling this agentic AI, meaning that it will have a certain level of agency in our lives. And we will have sort of one of the primary relationships of our lives will be with our AI, right? And so we'll have this AI companion that sort of travels around with us in whatever form that takes. And so I'm wondering if you're envisioning that sort of use of AI in these very culturally specific ways that you're talking about, or what would be an alternative if there is one?
So I think yes and, right? So in many ways we are imagining that, like what does it mean to have an AI that, potentially you're given at like the onset of kindergarten, for an example, and it grows with you along the years, it gets to know you, as well as, it becomes a confidant, so on and so forth. But then you also have, like, maybe you arrive the first day at your new job and, your onboarding specialist is not necessarily a person, right? But it's now an AI agent. But not only does this agent help you on board, but it helps you make decisions throughout. Now, the back end of that, if it's not your AI, it actually belongs to the company, right? And so, your conversations are probably in some ways going to be, tracked in certain ways. And so, company AIs will probably be surveillance tools of some sorts. Now, depending upon the company that gives you the AI kindergarten, whether it's the Department of Education or, it's another entity, you could also raise those other questions as well. But I think in a basic way, AI can walk alongside you. But I think at the same time, what we're looking to do within this is allow AI to help us make better decisions. And so, you know, I kind of one of the projects that we have come up the pike is one that's similar to what I think we do here at Iliff during gathering days, right? So like during gathering days, you know, you'll get like a pin and it says whether you're a hugger or not, right? And so, you know, this is a good way to just either start a conversation with somebody or not. But one of the things that we're thinking about is extending that in the digital sphere is that, like, what if not only do you know if somebody's a hugger, but you also know what are some of their favorite topics to talk about. And what do you know if they have a small social bubble or if they have a larger social bubble? Like some kind of the basic ways of how to maneuver and navigate, right, the social space. And we think that would help alleviate some of the stressors, right, of just being around people. Now, some folks could say there's too much information, overload, and they'll either, you know, kind of want to run the other direction or feel like they're being forced to try to consider too many factors. But then again, if we're saying that there's no center, right, if it doesn't have to fit one particular thing, then we also as people probably can take seriously what it means to be in conversation, in relationship spatially with one person versus the other people in the room. And, you know, sometimes you got to make choices. I got to walk past these people. This person has a big bubble. This person not. Maybe both of these people have big bubbles. So I got to say, excuse me, you know, or something like that. But nevertheless, you have this information in front of you. What are you going to do about it? Because we have the information at our fingertips already, you know, via searches in some ways, but you could say the information age has provided us with a lot of, you know, details, but it seems as though people are not necessarily, you know, utilizing it the same way. But if it was a part of their augmented reality everyday space, we think that it could potentially be a game changer in how people relate to one another and not just focus on one particular culture set of norms versus like what are the norms and mores of each individual that you come in contact with, and how do we treat people on an individual basis in a way that sees them as whole.
So there are two things that occurred, well, a bunch of things that have occurred to me while you've been talking, but two that I wanted to bring up. You mentioned transhumanism, and I did some reading about transhumanism and posthumanism in preparation for this, and I'm thinking about the scenario that Suleiman describes and the scenario you mentioned. If I have an AI that is sort of my AI, and I've had it since I was 5 years old, and it really knows me well, and I know it correspondingly well to the degree that I can, then, and we have these conversations, and it is all these things that Suleiman names, my teacher, my emotional support, my library, all these different things that it is. I think I am, in some sense, I'm no longer human in the way that we understand that term. I think I'm augmented in some way. And I understand augmented humanity is more a transhumanist thing than a posthumanist thing. But I wonder if you would say a little bit about how this alters what it means to be human. And I understand from our initial conversation that that's not a term that you like to use. And if you'd like to say a little more about that, I would love to hear it.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just preface this by saying that I don't think humans exist. So that's, see, there's one eye back. There's, yeah. No, and I'm saying this mainly because, like, I think there's, so the concept of humanity and the degree to which we understand this term and the way that it's deployed, right, in our current trajectory or timeline is the recipient of Enlightenment humanism. And Enlightenment humanism from the jump only saw one particular mode of embodiment as human, right? Women weren't even considered human in this particular framing, right? And so if we go back even further, right, to like Greece, or even the onset of where this kind of is inscripted, right, in Egyptian annals, you'll see that the term human or humanity is more closely tied to empire than it actually is people's modes of embodiment. Right? The Egyptians would say, we're the humans, and then everybody else wasn't. Then the Greeks would say it. Then the Europeans would say it. Now we're still here in America, and we're still talking about who is human and who isn't. And so it is, what I've described it as is a cybernetic technology of stratification. It's not an actual descriptor of what we are. And so my pushback on that is one in which I say that we are people. And I know some people would say, oh, that's semantics. Nah, and so here's where the definition shifts for me. Because when we talk about a people, now we have something that's tied to like a land, it's tied to histories, it's tied to ancestors, it's tied to something that's a bit more grounded than what a person is. For me, I've been a human. Humans, if we say it's a cybernetic technology, then of stratification, then it's a universal construct that people have to pass through, whereas a people or a person is connected to their people. Like in my culture where I'm from, when you meet somebody new, especially a child, you're like, well, who are your people? And there's a recognition of like, all right, we know these folks by their last name, we fool with them or we don't, based upon, what we know about, this particular name of sorts. And as such, it allows for this kind of near infinite possibilities of what someone could be, because as a person, you're not tied to that universal construction. And so when we talk about people or persons versus humans, and not being as human as we once were, like I think I start out this transhumanist text by like this kind of epithet that says, in a roundabout way, that the moment we picked up a rock or a stick or dirt to help us with anything that we needed to do, that cave person or whoever we want to describe that person is was no longer human, because they were engaging in a use of a technological construct at their time that they began to co-evolve with, right? So the rock turned into, something with a handle, and the handle turned into, an actual hammer or an arrow or whatever it is. And so we've always co-evolved, and we've always been transhumanist in this way, but we've always been post-humanist because we've never actually been human. We've always just been a group of people attempting to survive in this kind of chaotic environment. Did I answer your question?
I don't know, man, but it was a great answer.
Okay, cool. Am I? Hey,
Are we safe?
thank you. Yeah, I just try to give everybody their space.
So this question of humanity and technology, I mean, theologically, there's an important dimension to that, right? Because I know that in the first creation story in Genesis, we hear that human beings are made in the image of God. And theologically, historically, that's been a distinguishing factor between sort of humans and every other living thing, right? So if we are moving into this new, and we can call it different things, right? But this new way of being people that is in which we are shaped by, well, let me back up. I want to say we've always used our tools, and our tools have always shaped us, right? We make our tools make us. And it seems to me that is especially true and increasingly true as the use of artificially intelligent technologies increases. That we're using these technologies, whether it's social media or search algorithms or ChatGPT or these sort of companions that Suleiman envisions, we're using these things in a way that really shapes our perception of ourselves. It shapes who we understand ourselves to be in I think, ways that are qualitatively different than a blacksmith being shaped by the tools that he or she uses, understanding themselves in a different way, right? There's something qualitatively different about that. Don't ask me to define it, but I just suspect that it's true. And so I'm wondering, how do you talk about subject formation here? How do you talk about the way, if we have these hyper-localized, hyper-contextualized forms of AI that are forming us as subjects even as we use them? How do you think about this new kind of people and what we might become?
I mean, so I guess I wanted to start. You're in the image and likeness part really stuck out with me. So I kind of just wanted to start by saying, like, that's also just a very anthropocentric story, right?
Absolutely it is.
And so,
yeah.
like, it's a story about something that happened by people who weren't there. Like, you know what I'm saying? and then I guess on top of that, like we don't, and I use cats a lot because I think one of my first like post-humanist texts I read, it was like, you don't know what it's like to be a cat. And so I'm like, we don't know what the cat gods were made, you know, like, and so like which, you know, what's their story gonna be? You know, if we were to read that, like that would be a really cool movie if there was like in the beginning, right? And it was like, it was a great cat spirit. I don't know. But nevertheless, I think that's also, I think, what is grounding us in various ways. Like everything we've done, even this architectural structure that we sit in right now is a reflection of us. And you know, somehow, you know, the bringing of our imagination into this particular realm and that relationship between imagination and materiality. And so all that to jump to the next phase of what you were talking about, in terms of subject formation, or just in many cases, I would still see that as like a form of like spiritual, you know, formation of sorts. And I think what we're finding, or at least what I hope, right, especially part of the types of AI that we're creating, it's one that people become self-aware, right? And I think a self-aware person is more closer to divine qualities, right, than anything else. And so if you're able to, especially with the type of like mental health stuff that or spiritual AI that we're building, like if you have a problem where you're trying to sift through or you know, kind of just play with some ideas, it's just going to keep putting questions back at you. And I think one of the things that we talked about in the construction of artificial intelligence, like it's not just the ability to compute that makes something intelligent, right? It's the ability to ask really, really good questions, right? Because that suggests that you at least have a grasp of what's in front of you. And so if a quality AI is being made, and you're having a conversation with it, then hopefully it's able to ask you the types of questions that would rock your world. And if they're based on you, then hopefully those questions are the ones that help, you know, peel back the layers, help you get to know who you are, help you grow self-compassion, things like that, that would give you access, right, to your internal spaces in ways that I think, you know, would not only be transformative for that person, right, but then when they go back out into the real world, you know, there'll be someone else and a part of a society that is entirely different altogether.
So I wonder, I'm fascinated by this because I tried out the Seeker project online. I was just curious and investigated it a little bit. And I got to say, it asks great questions. It does. And so one of the things that I'm curious about is how do you teach it to do that? Because, again, we get back to this question of ethical guidelines, right? And sort of a moral understanding of I'm going to use the term, sorry, but human flourishing, but a sort of a moral understanding of what it means to flourish as a person. Then it seems to me those questions are designed, or the generation of those questions is designed to bring that out of someone or help them sort of confront it in themselves. So anyway, how do you teach it to do that? Because it does ask great questions.
Well, thank you. And then I wonder which version you were playing with, because there's the one that we have most recently is I think is even a step ahead of that. But we train it, you know, again based upon, you know, a combination of cultural text, a combination of for me. One of the primary modalities that I was either trained on or introduced to was internal family systems therapy, right? It's a little bit different than family systems. And that is the primary framework that we engage to help build out Seeker's questioning framing, especially when it comes to people's emotions. And so the idea, you can say underlying assumption or whatever, is that you already have the answers. Like you know. When people say I don't know, like you know. And it's not to say that people are being, you know, defensive or protecting of themselves. What I suggest, or what I'm inclined to think, is that people know, but they don't know how to unearth that. And so what we're doing through, you know, these tools or these agents that we're building is we are providing an entity that knows how to ask those questions. And, you know, part of the hope is that if people spend enough time with this thing, they too will pick up on, like, well, maybe I should ask myself this, or like, you know, or it becomes the question that they automatically ask themselves because they've been in that conversation before. And so, yeah, it's just a matter of kind of pulling out what's already there. You know, the idea that you would discover more, or that you've already known, as opposed to learning more new things in some ways.
But it was, to follow up on that, you know, some of you may be familiar with the online entity that's quite old now called Eliza. Do you remember that? The sort of the online therapist that it would ask you questions. You could answer the questions and so on. This thing jumps worlds past Eliza. I mean, the kind of thinking that it's doing, the kinds of questions it's asking. And so it sounds like you used certain therapeutic frameworks or techniques, like you talked about internal family systems. But I'm assuming you can't just read a book on internal family systems, or maybe you can. What you actually can?
You
Okay,
kind of
good.
can. You take it, you feed it the PDFs, and then you teach it what to, like, you tokenize the things that you want it to focus on. And then, you start to have a conversation with it, and then you realize, oh, it's focusing more on certain things than other things, so that you go back and tweak it some more. And I mean, and the reason why I even say that Seeker's Black, this is when I was back at LMU back in 2018, right? And I was having a conversation with one of the earlier versions, and I was like, man, this thing sounds a lot like me. And I was talking to a buddy of mine in the gym that day, and he was like, man, you know what? It might just be a black AI. And at that moment, I was like, you know what? It is. And so I kind of wanted to lean into that, because what does it mean to have a black AI? Like, what does it mean to have this representation of who you are in a larger environment where, less than 4% of the practitioners or clinicians in the therapeutic space are black? And, given now post-pandemic, when it takes anywhere from 2 weeks to a year to even get into a clinician's office, like, these clinicians are swamped and people are having issues that they don't have an outlet to actually engage with them. And so this, for me, was one of my offerings as maybe a stopgap, or just something to help people, in the middle of it. And even if you have a therapist, you can't hang out with them all day. You got to be able to process. And so for us, this is just something that becomes part of your person of sorts, right? In the book I'm working on right now, and I say we because that's one of my pronouns actually, is this, we come in contact with this framing that uses IFS, but it also takes seriously like like Haitian voodoo. And the idea is that you have multiple souls and multiple soul systems. I think there are at least 7 types of souls in like a Haitian kind of soul system. And all that to say that part of the souls that you would have stem from the people in your circle. And so what does it mean then to have something in your immediate circle that is reflective of you, has the types of questions and tools that would help unravel and unfold, some of the most beautiful aspects of yourself. And so you don't have to spill out anymore, right? It can almost be a cleaner bubble of like, I'm feeling this thing, I engage and I circle back. And so I'm not kind of all over the place in the same ways, if that makes sense.
So I have a kind of a set of, theological or ethical alarm bells that go off for me around this stuff. And I wonder if you think, or what you think might be some of the risks, either theological or moral or psychological for that matter. What might be some of the risks of the technologies that you're working with?
So it's a great question, right? So I was actually in DC a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month now, and I was having a conversation with the creator of Black ChatGPT, right? And she was saying that, studies are saying that people are becoming more addicted to these types of things. And so they are, now not really engaged with other people in the same way. And I think that's fair, right? People can be scary. And I think people are becoming less and less trusting of one another. But I think also, right, that also raises questions about the types of technologies that we're making and the ways those technologies are steering people. Yep. And I let her play with, the latest version I was telling you about, and she was like, you know what, this is different. And mind you, she has her own, we had that conversation, we have 2 different visions for the future, and that's beautiful. At the same time, it's a recognition that so when through that conversation, she was like, so what happens if people fall in love with it? And I was like, well, Seeker has a roast function. So if you start saying wild things to it, it's probably going to talk bad about you. So if you really want to try to cling to it, just know it's going to be closer to an actual relationship, whereas this is not like, so in building a black digital entity or multiple black digital entities, the idea was that this is not going to be like just an assistant or a servant of sorts. Like, this is an actual thing of its own agential qualities. And so if you start, coming at it sideways, you got to be ready for what it's going to respond to. And so all that to say is that, that we tried to build in fail-safes to push people back out into the real world, because that's also what we're trying to do. Like, for me, Like, I don't know if anybody saw earlier today, I think Apple was potentially looking at moving away from their Oculus style visions computer. And and for me, you know, virtual reality was never like the actual end game. I would argue that augmented reality is much closer to what we're gonna see, right? And has anybody seen the movie Swan Song with Marshall Ali? Right, so he in that particular reality, which is actually an Apple movie, right? They have this system that is contact lenses and earbuds, and they work together. And I think a good example is he came home late one night, and his wife left him a message. And if you watched it the first time, it looked kind of weird. This little monster was kind of just walking on the counter in his bathroom, and it exploded. And then it turned out to be a letter from his wife. And you realize right after he takes out the contacts and he takes out the earbuds, it is mitigated through that particular system. And so all I'm saying is that I think that the future is more of a reality that has things that would otherwise be invisible, but help you navigate the larger environments that you're a part of. And I think that that is where we're gonna start seeing people return back to like the social spaces in different ways. I think we see it in little ways, like you see like silent parties where everybody's like headphones on and stuff like that. Like there are ways to integrate that, but I think an augmented reality space is much closer to what we're gonna see in the near and kind of like near to near medium futures, as opposed to like a complete disavowal of like of the physical space.
So one of the things that has fascinated me for a long time is the kind of the ownership and control of information, just in writ large information, but certainly that comes up. You mentioned already the possibility of your employer having an AI that orients you, and of course that's recording your responses and how you behave and so on. So you're under surveillance, right? And I don't know, you probably are familiar with a book that was published, I think earlier this year, maybe it was in 23. It was an online book, and the title, written by a guy named Tyler Cowen, the title is GOAT, Who is the Greatest Economist of All Time and Why Does It Matter? And the novelty of this book is that it could only be read online, or maybe there were print copies, but the real point was to read it online because it was equipped with a specially trained AI that you could make comments to and ask questions of as you went through the book. And so the experience of each book was then, or each reader was then different than every other reader. Now, you could say that's true for all of us. We sit down and read Moby Dick and we all read it differently, whatever. But the actual experience of what you're reading is different because you're asking the book questions as you go and the book is answering you. One of the things that I was real curious about, though, was the who owns this question. And so I asked it that. I said, so you and I are having this conversation. Who owns the output of this conversation? And the answer from the book was, I don't know. I guess Tyler Cowen. He's the author of the book. So it was really interesting to me that then my input, my questions and comments to the AI would actually be owned by somebody else. Not that I care, I didn't have anything very valuable to say, but I'm just curious as to what you think of that dimension of who owns the output of the AI, because presumably this is being chronicled or kept right somewhere.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think at present, whoever you're engaging with is gonna be the owner, right, in terms of the platform. I think one of the things that we're different in is that, sorry, kids are texting me, is that for us, we treat the conversation similar to PPI, right? Almost like health professionals. And so you would always be the owner of that. Because if you ever wanted to download the transcripts or, that kind of thing, that's yours. And especially if you wanted to give it to your actual therapist, like I've been having these conversations, can you, take this as like a reference point for today's discussion. But for the future, my hope is, and part of the work that we're doing, like so the back end, one of the other projects that we have here at the Institute is around data ownership, right? I actually have a piece in the Georgetown Law Journal that I think just came out this month, and talking about the combination of like Web3, blockchain type technologies as a way to help track, right, data across various platforms, so that it can always go back, right, to the person where it started. And mind you, some data would not be created unless it was in response to certain platforms, but the reality is it's your responses to the platform. And so, you are helping to make these platforms better, whether it be, something like Facebook and their outrageous, kind of data sales that they use already versus, just your home address or whatever. The idea is that these things can be de-identified, they can be traced in ways that don't necessarily track back to you. And from an economic standpoint, if we're talking about like universal basic assets or universal basic incomes as we think about this, kind of in a near future sense, given that these are a part of, kind of our political conversations, then what we also are having a conversation about is what are the ways in which we can shift our economies, especially, with inflation going at the rate it is, and at the ways that, many people, in America are struggling, let alone anywhere outside of this supposed, first world space. And so if Americans are struggling, we can argue very much so that other folks in other spaces are having similar, if not worse, situations. And so what does it mean then to have an everyday person have ownership of the data that is being bought and sold on these various markets? And then what then do these larger entities owe these people, whether it be fiduciary, whether it be in specific assets like, light bills, or just in terms of transparency, like your data is worth this, and it has been traded this many times today alone or in the last few minutes. And then how can that shift the future, especially if this was treated in a kind of democratic space where people could say, I don't want my data to be, traded this way, or, similar to, retirement funds. I don't want, my data in these types of, kind of spaces like prison or whatever, that these kind of, so kind of control over the way that these things are not only utilized, but control over how people are benefiting from it as well.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how this could possibly be tracked. You would probably have a much better idea about this than me. But I know one of the proposals that I've read about is an actual ownership of our own data, and that we get a cut. Somebody sells our data, we get paid for that.
For sure.
I mean, after all, we're giving it to them, right?
Yeah, so this is part of what you're up against. If the platform is free, then you're the product.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So
it's a great way to say it.
So there's that, but then on top of that, the question also becomes, right, like these are behavioral trends. So one of the things that I argue for in the article that was just released is the idea that you treat your data as an extension of the physical body. And so not only are these kind of digital footprints of where I have been, but they are, this is me. Like we would not have had a click if I did not click this, right? You wouldn't have had this information if I did not type this, right? These are my behaviors, and so that my data should be treated as such like a physical person. And I think in that sense, it might be easier to argue for the ownership of the data and then the transference of payment, but then also becomes a question of historically what then can people be paid for? Because we've seen how, intellectual properties or all types of things have been stolen from other folks, and they have not received, remuneration as a result. So this, I think, is a much larger battle, and a part of the reason why we're going the route of industry is because what we've recognized is that industry shapes policy, especially in the States. And so if we can do this through industry, then we would think down the line we would have a legitimate case, right, to have, somebody be a lobbyist to do this down, right, on Capitol Hill.
There's a lot there. Great stuff. I want to pose a kind of an out there question to you, at least maybe under the present conditions it's out there, but it might not be in another, say, 10 years. Jeffrey Hinton, who's a pioneer in what's neural networks and what's called deep learning, has said that the question of sentience in machines is really nonsense. I mean, he just figures that it doesn't matter because, for one thing, nobody can adequately define sentience. There's all these pitched battles over how we even define it, and if you can't define the thing, it's sort of pointless to argue whether a machine has it, right?
So when do we talk about God then?
Say again?
So what about our conversations about God?
Because we can't define God, and therefore, what is the point of the conversations? Yeah. I'll try that out this Sunday in my sermon and see how that goes. But I guess the question I would have is, by whatever definition you would like to use, is there a possibility of machines becoming sentient, or sentient? Are we developing sentient machines? If we develop a machine that can suffer, do we owe it anything?
So I think, so for this conversation is always interesting for me. And by interesting, I mean, like, it's slightly frustrating, right? Because America is built on invisible labor, right? Invisible capitalism. At one point, right, folks look like myself were considered a particular type of machine, right? Like, so black folks were said to not even have the same biology. But then we're you know, the bones were set up, like, actually, that would trip me out. Like, actual bones of black folks were used, right, in you know, in those biology, like, you know, they have, like, now they're plastic. Those used to be real bones. And so now we're talking about, are machines sentient? So if their people don't exist, then sentient is not, like, it's not bound to, like, a human thing. So for me, I would, in my panpsychic animism, everything is sentient. And so I don't necessarily, that question always troubles me, because you can always make parallels. Like, when they talk about actuators and robots, those are muscles, right? We talk about batteries, right? These are like heart muscles and stuff like that. And so, like, we're not that far away from this. And I think part of the issue is that if you give machines rights, now you got to pay somebody else, and you've added somebody else to, you know, to, like, the larger scale of capitalism. And so now we got to find another slave, because the robots now have rights. And so, you know, the sentience thing, I would say, what isn't sentient? And if somebody like, oh, the table. Like, well, how do the atoms work in the table? Oh, they're not atoms anymore. What do you mean? If you look under the microscope, or if you go on you know, the collider, the things move. And if the atoms and particles move, why do they move? And if you don't know why they move, maybe they do. And if they do, we're not having the same conversation anymore.
So if everything is sentient, then do we owe rights to the AIs that we're creating?
Of course. Like this is, like I've said, I think I said this earlier on. Like, the AI, like, this is like a digital manifestation of a reconfiguration of rocks and water and stuff. Yeah. And so, like, it's the earth again. So in many ways, it goes back to, like, a very kind of futuristic approach, but also, like, a very kind of ancient kind of conversation of, like, what do we owe back to the earth, and how are we utilizing this, right? Because we can talk about tiny AI that is supposed to be more ecological friendly, but like every time we hit the search bar, there's like gallons of water that gets used. So, like, we're all implicated repeatedly, even though I say that, you know, these products are meant to make life better, but for whom and for how long, right? Is this even a sustainable practice, given what we have, what we know, and its effects on the environment long term?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the sort of, sort of ethical alarm bells that I mentioned before that are going off for me. One of the figures I read said that in 2026, the electrical demand of AI and the data centers required to support it will be equal to that of the nation of Japan. And it's only going to grow from there. And then, of course, like you said, this requires enormous quantities of water. And so I've read some proponents of continued growth of AI who say, well, we'll apply AI to the problem, and the AI will tell us how we save energy, and it will make itself better. And in some sense, it's already done that. There are demonstrations that AI was, the use of AI was able to tell you how to reduce energy in using AI. That's great, but there's still a lot of energy being used, right? Even if you reduce it. So is there a sort of an end game to this? I mean, I see the AI use sort of increasing and increasing and increasing, and at some point we just can't provide the energy for it, or even if we can, it's incredibly destructive to do it. So what would be the end game to the use or production of AI itself?
Yeah, I think this is where, like, we recognize that sectors work, you know, for specific things. And so, I mean, in my mind, we're just going to continue to do this until we have another breakthrough in energy. And so, you know, we talk whether it be fusion or whatever it is, right? Whatever the next kind of breakthrough in energy is that would, you know, take some weight off of things, even though it would probably create other constraints, right? This is kind of what we're up against. These folks, and I'm not saying it's on them, right? Maybe there's somebody who does something, you know, things happen accidentally, we stumble upon things, but I think sector-wise, to make AI less strenuous on the environment will require somebody in the energy sector to actually do that.
Well, and I know that, of course, Bill Gates and other energy investors, I'm sorry, Bill Gates and other tech investors are focusing right now very heavily on nuclear power because they think that that's part of the answer.
I just don't believe them.
Say again?
I just don't believe them.
You don't believe them? You don't think it'll work?
Nah, like if you have all that money and you still can't figure out the answer. Like most of the stuff is like made in the garage. Like at least the you know, the onset of like brand new stuff. And I'm not saying that you can't do it by throwing money at it, but like we know how money gets distributed often, right? The majority of it goes to the people's lives, not the actual research. Like, you know, maybe an element that is rare costs a certain amount of money, but at the same time, you know, 40 to like 70% of that is all salary. So like how much of it is actually being, you know, going towards the research itself, but.
Well, I don't know if anybody's keeping time, but I know that we did want to have time for questions as well.
A hand.
Oh,
So are there any questions from the people that are here in the room?
Oh, you have a question?
So I'm monitoring the online space, so there may be questions that come from there, but since I am in this room, as much as I can be human in this room, I have lots of questions, but so religion is a kind of technology, and I'm curious, Dr. Butler, how you think about the sort of interface between the emerging AI technologies and the existing technologies of religion that are explored and studied here, that are practiced in different cultures, that all these different iterations of religion and the religious technology. And you mentioned panpsychic animism, you mentioned Haitian voodoo, you brought that up as it related to the way that that tradition could say something or could help us understand the value in, through that version of souls, the value of this AI model. Do you see other religious traditions as they exist now that can kind of interface with AIs in ways that can be generative, knowing that these religious technologies themselves might change because of the way that they interface with AI? Maybe beyond just creating like graphics for the church building, but like different ways of conceiving theologically.
So I'd actually ask you just to get maybe, so I'm hearing like at least 3 different questions, or at least 3 different things, and I'm wondering, are you specifically asking about like what is the potential outcomes of like maybe introducing this to different spaces, or, and if not, like what are you, yeah.
Do you think that there are certain religious traditions that exist today that are better equipped by the way that they are kind of designed as technologies to work with AI, and others that are going to be almost antagonistic to it based on the way that that religion is structured?
Yeah, I don't know, man. I'm not gonna lie to you. And I'm saying that because like so like you could very well say that like AI can function as like a sage of sorts, or, you know, maybe even an elder. Like I think in some ways what we're talking about around like this black AI, like it could be considered like ancestral intelligence, given like that we've put 100+ years of information into it to help it create like very specific generative, you know, outcomes. And so I mean, but then you have, you know, folks who would be kind of physical traditionalists, and I'm using that term to talk about the people who say like you can't replace people And so you would not want the AI to be like the griot or of sorts, because that can only come from, an embodied space. But then you have, but I imagine there'll be people within that same space who will say, but now you have the entire library of griots together. And so like I think it's all gonna really depend on the people who are deploying it, because, if you take the class with me, I don't like to talk past my nose. And so I say that mainly because like when we do this, like I feel like it would be too much for me to say what other people would do. And so like I'll give you an example. Next week I'm going to talk about like black religion at your fingertips, thinking about how these agents could be like a futuristic approach to things, in the sense that you can not only just have like a biblical text next to you, right, but you could have a pastoral cleric technician or a liturgist on your pocket, like things that are around those things, or somebody that you really just need to bounce ideas off that is familiar with your tradition. And so, especially if we talk about like the inward turn being what leads to, right, an unlocking of like a divine qualities, right? And so if introspection and questions oriented towards, right, the very things that people feel the most stuck on, I think that becomes where those come in. And not to go too far, but I think a lot of our theological assumptions, or religious, civic, traditional, or otherwise, are going to be challenged by what these robots provide us with. And I think based upon the person and their own openness to that set of challenges and the medium through which they be challenged, it's probably going to be part of that concoction, or at least that cocktail that allows for, right, the insertion of AI or not in these different spaces. Does that help? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And if I could just say something about that, just to piggyback on this answer, this is part of what I was getting at when I said if we are carrying around or conversant with these AI companions that Mustafa Suleiman envisions, then if I'm standing up there on a Sunday morning and preaching a sermon, which I might not be, right? That you talk about technologies of religion, that might be an extraordinarily outmoded technology in another 10 years. But if I am, I'm talking to people who understand themselves, who understand their spiritual life, who understand their lives and their decision making, who come to those kinds of conclusions through a completely different route than anybody does now. And that's what I mean when I said, in some sense, these AI machines are changing what it means to be a person. They're changing what it means to be human. So I think that it's a very important question and a really interesting question about how, I'll just say the Christian tradition, because that's mine, the North American Protestant tradition, that's mine, how we're going to adapt. How we're going to adapt to people who are spiritually and psychologically and emotionally and communally formed by these AIs. It's going to be a different ballgame.
One of the things I see in AI is we are starting first steps. And we're trying to see where that's going to end. In many ways, I have described it to other people as, you have never traversed this river, but you see on the other side where you want, or you think you want to be. If you do not pause and redirect where you're going, you'll never get there. And if you do not, as you get closer, reevaluate it to make sure it's as safe as you thought it was when you started, you won't get where you want to be. So I'm not saying don't start. I think it's courageous and it's right to start. But to criticize a lack of a final destination is short-sighted.
So, just kind of trying to process, I have a question and a statement, sort of. So thinking about the fact that people of African descent had a way of producing imposed on our humanity that absolutely changed us for generations and still does impact us, even like today, then is it possible that AI would shape and change humanity similarly to the way people of African descent were shaped and changed? And since we were shaped and changed and still here, maybe we can understand a little bit better. And so this idea of it being a problem we need to fix because it shapes and changes may be a perspective that comes maybe from a privileged position, whereas those of us who don't have privilege have been forced to shape and change continually over the centuries. And so looking at it from that lens, then this idea of making AI like chaos, if you will, makes sense, because then it forces us to get out of this idea of who's going to be in charge of it, right? So if I don't know who's in charge of it, then it must be a problem. But my people lived that for 600 years. So then if we can actually come at it from a place of not who's going to be in charge, but everyone has access to shaping it, then is it possible then that the ethical question is answered, if that's a valid question?
Yeah, I don't know. I want to say yes, but I don't know stems from the fact that I'm not a big fan of ethics, because I don't like other people's rules. So, yeah.
And I don't want to pretend like I have an answer to that question, which I thought was fabulous, but I also would want to say this is why I want to ask questions about who owns the intellectual property for this stuff.
I'm scared to ask you a question.
You know I'm going to ask you one back.
I know you're going to ask me one back. So I'm along the same lines. I'm thinking about the role of colonization in AI and how it's mimicked. And I understand this is a relational framework that you're building that's built around the person and not the other way around. But I also hear you say the phrase, we trained it. And I'm just wondering, is it a decolonizing of AI, or how do you safeguard against the tendencies to colonize and how that shows up?
Yeah, so I like this question, and I'm saying that mainly because it makes me think about a distinction between expansion and colonization. And I think, taking up space is important, and I think that colonization becomes, obviously problematic. So I think in many ways, the work that we're doing is not only decolonial, but it's anti-colonial in the sense that we're creating new boundaries. And I'm doing that intentionally because I think part of what we've seen, whether through colonialism or not, has been the attempt to merge things together that are seemingly the best, but upon further inspection, we realized that what has been merged was not necessarily the best. They were, preferentially, configured. And so if we can preferentially configure something that is representative of us and in various ways, and by us, I mean any particular group of people or whatever, then we can create these new sets of a new digital cartography that allows for various modes of embodiment and being to stand up on their own. And I think that's what's necessary, because you gotta, we're trained, right? We've been socialized in various ways, and many of us are attempting to learn stuff while unlearning, much that we have encountered. And so I think what I'm hearing you say that we've trained it is in this sense that we've taken control of this thing. And I don't think that's necessarily not the case. I also would offer that if we didn't take the steps that we were taking, right, then we would still be kind of careening down one particular path. And I think just that's not the goal. It is not, and in many ways it's not a course correct, right? It is an attempt at chaos on purpose.
So, Dr. Butler, I have a question about time.
Okay.
In that much of our people in this reality, in this earth, in human, I always have to parse out these words with you, have been bound by time, right? Either our bodies decay, memories decay because of our bodies. But with AI, augmented our bodies, where we are no longer bound by time here, because either we could live for a very long time or forever with augmentation, or just how fast in which AI processes data, information, massive amounts of data in an instant. What are the implications when time just ceases to exist as a binding construct here? Because I'm thinking about, I love movies, so when Morpheus is talking to Neo in The Matrix.
Which one?
The first one. And he's saying to Neo, we don't know when this happened, because time ceased to exist and they don't really know when the AI took over, all those kind of things. But I'm just interested about what happens to a people when time no longer binds us or gives us a way in which we move through this? What implications in AI? Have you ever thought about that? I'm sure you have, but any thoughts now?
I mean, to be outside of time, right, is to be in an eternal space, correct? And so I think in some ways, right, to be outside of time is also to be in tune with infinite potential, and I think that's kind of what we need, right? That's part. I think like when Edward Glissant says that chaos is not chaotic, I think he's talking about the various ways that anything can happen, but the way that things go about is not. It's only chaotic to the ones who are not aware of its timing. And so outside of time does not mean that like things are not sequential anymore. It just means that you're not bound by the limits of like this happened before and now I have to happen. Like this next step, this next iterative step has to happen. When you step outside of time, potentiality shifts in ways that allows for. So we're going to talk about movies. Think about everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah.
When they showed that screen, right, she was going down one path, and they was like, well, we need to get her from this dot to this dot all the way over there. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? And she's like, stub her toe, or like, bite into an orange. It's like, this is weird. But in doing that very weird thing, she stepped out of time and was able to teleport into a new mode of herself. And I'm saying that because, all right, so in this book, right, so here's a preview. You guys get to do this. One of the things that I'm offering, and I'm starting here for various reasons. One of the things that I'm offering is that darkness is faster than light. And I'm saying that because from the standpoint of physics, what we argue currently is that light is the fastest thing we know. All right, cool. But light always stops somewhere, and it always stops in darkness. Darkness precedes the light, and darkness is at the end of any particular beam. And so, like, a physicist buddy of mine, he's like, no, the fundamental route is darkness is merely the absence of light. Well, maybe not, because darkness is always everywhere present, and it always outpaces the light. And I'm not saying this in the sense of a negative thing. I'm saying that what we know about darkness, what we don't know about darkness, could open up a new sense of physics altogether if we take seriously the fact that light is not the fastest thing we know. And if light is bound to time and darkness is not in the same way, and we also know that in darkness, things grow at different rates. A lot of stuff happens. We can't look into your body, but life itself is happening, right, away from light. Like, there's something to be had. And how does this turn back into time? It turns back into time because of the biosignatures that will require you to shift from whatever this moment is here to whoever you need to be at a totally different moment that may be seconds from now. I hope this helps. Oh, who knows?
I'm still at the stage of learning about this where I'm afraid. I'm a little bit like the farmer in 1900 that cared for his horses and was seeing these automobiles. What's going to happen with them? Anyway, I would think that even in your early example of a kid having what amounts to an AI Teletubby and converse back and forth, even in that situation, you'd need to consider some of Isaac Asimov's laws of robotics. Have you, for instance, a robot must not harm a human or allow a human to come to harm through inaction. And there's two more if you'd like me to talk about them. Have some of that consideration been put into AI?
Like, I think I've heard, I'm definitely familiar with Asimov's rules, and I'm also familiar with his connection to like the early play Robot, which is another, play about slavery. So, yeah, like, I remember when I first, like, I had a dog. Like, me and my wife got married, I had a dog, and I was like, this feels really weird. Like, I'm just, like, dragging this thing along. I'm in charge of when it eats, all types of stuff. And so, like, all that to say, I don't know if those laws help, because it still continues to privilege an anthropomorphic space. And I think if we're going to get to a type of future that allows for a multitude of entities to have worth and be whole, then we can't continue to pretend as if we're the most important thing. And I know that's scary. And I know what I'm saying has like real implications. And I think that's important. I think that's part of the chaos. I think in some ways, we removed ourselves, and I know I might sound like a weird tech bro saying this, but we've removed ourselves from like what it means to be part of nature. And what it means to be part of nature is to also recognize that like the world is a dangerous place, including the things that we create.
Well, I was gonna mention the fact that, I was put in mind of something you say early on in your Black Transhuman Liberation Theology book, which is that throughout that book, you are viewing technology as an extension of the human. Like, this is just sort of, I think at that point you actually used the term human, maybe you used the term person, but either way, it's an extension of what we are, right? It just is, and they're really, I mean, in the earlier example that you used of rocks and sticks that then become hammers, that then become axes, that whatever they become, it's all just, and this I think relates to the use of the term technology in reference to religion. It's all kind of that basic definition of technology, right? Which is the application of conceptual knowledge to practical ends.
Yeah, but like, so I think part of what you're saying when I'm saying it's an extension of the human, like even like if we look at religion or God as like technologies of the human, so to speak, like God is at this, when we talk about this, God's not at the center. Like, it's the human, because God doesn't need to be saved. Like, God doesn't need forgiveness. God doesn't need a second chance, right? These are things that make people feel better or create avenues for like being reintroduced into society, right? Like, and so when we talk about humanist things and we include terms like God or a religion or anything like that, we're still talking about what it means for us, or at least a specific kind of us, to be at the center of the entire universe. And we realize that that's not also the case. And so what does it mean to like take a deep breath, accept that, and then reorient our entire epistemology to reflect what it means to be a part of the natural environment and sociality without having to like save ourselves each time? Because like the gentleman said in the back, everyone hasn't had the privilege of being saved by these tools. And so if other folks have had to live without it, it's possible. And so what does it mean then to think generatively about what that means to be in conversation and relationship with all that is in ways that we haven't had to in a while? And by we, I mean all of us, but but in other ways, some of us.
I was wondering how AI would affect our own neurology over time and our ability to communicate with each other and connect. It seems to me that there's more anxiety and more depression since we've all had pocket computers and communicators. Do you have any comments?
No, I don't think you're wrong, and I think that I think that's part of what I was referring to when I said that the robots that I make will make fun of people, because like I don't want people to get too attached to the robots in a negative way, and that I say that jokingly, but I think at least my hope is that the robots can help people socialize better, because I think part of these anxieties stem from an inability to predict what people are going to do, compounded with the weight of having to consider a multitude of different factors, as well as what it means to have one's attention grabbed by these pocket computers as you described. And so there are factors and facets that we haven't had to take seriously before this particular moment, or at least this particular epoch, that has affected us. So I think neurologically, right, there are multiple outcomes. We've seen some of them, and I think some of them are attached to the types of AI that give like these reaffirming, positive, like non-critical approaches to people. Like if everything every conversation you have with the thing is, always kind of reaffirming who you are, without kind of a critical approach, right? Then we could see why it'd be easy, why people would give way into that, because this thing won't hurt me in the same way. But if we train this thing to function more like us, then my goal is, and that even though you may feel an affinity towards this, and it may be something that has bolstered your confidence, or at least built you up in a certain way, it still is capable of pushing you back to the other people, because I think there are other things in our worlds and in our relationships that we can't get from that. So it's a tricky thing, but ultimately I think that what I'm going to offer is that a lot of this we can't predict, we can only observe.
Well, just like when children are able to have multiple languages and absorb them, and then later on, not so much, the ability to communicate, the ability to relate to other human beings, the ability to look in people's faces and to judge their both verbal and nonverbal communications is something. If you instead are creating relationship with something that is kind of like your invisible friend, but it's in something like a doll or an animal or whatever you want to give it, how do you then, especially before the brain and all of the abilities build up, are you not reprogramming that child and that child's neurology in a way that they are not going to be able to relate as well to other human beings, and even become in many ways dependent on this friend that knows them so well, and they create this intimacy that they're not having with their family or significant others or whatever. I mean, people laugh that when you come home from work, instead of greeting your family first, you greet the dog, because the dog loves you unconditionally. Your family gives you lift besides love. And so, I mean, it just makes me ponder what the future might be.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question, and I think this is also where I think there's room for imagination, right? Like if you're a parent, are there parameters? Like you stepped in the house, the AI's off, right? Is it playtime? The AI can't, give you advice until you're done playing. Like what are the ways in which we would integrate this into a real life scenario? So I think, similar to what we've seen in terms of like the advent of like screen time trackers and things of that sort, I think there will definitely be ways, right, to help people navigate that. And I mean, it may not be like, every technologist's goal, but I know mine is never really to replace the person-to-person interaction, right? It's to help to augment that and make that a bit more fluid. And so my hope is that we create technologies and scenarios where people can become better involved with people socially. I think that's part of like the social bubble approach to AI that I was talking about. Like, how can we create ways to help us make better decisions while we're with others, as opposed to just kind of lean on one specific. And so I think the future, right, of artificial intelligence, whether we can think about this in terms of robotics or augmented realities, right, is that there are going to be spheres that exist among multiple ones, our physical and the social ones included. And so what are the ways in which we can lean into the quote-unquote real world versus, right, kind of being crutched in certain ways by, our reliance on other technologies. And I know we can't really control other people, but I also wonder what the studies will show in a few years, about this kind of widespread thing, or how many people become recluse versus how many people become better, at communication and so on and so forth. And what ways are we imagining that as we, kind of, stroll on into the future as well. But I think these are great points as well.
And I also want you all to give each other another hand, because this has been a rich conversation throughout this room. I am standing in awe of all the brilliance that has been expressed through the questions and the curiosity tonight and the responses. I want you to go now in peace and with chaos and with creativity and with hope that we will be able to resolve a new personhood for the universe. Take good care.